I'm Dr. Joe Sprinkle, and this will be a lecture on Psalm 45, a royal wedding psalm. Let's begin by reading it. My heart overflows with a pleasing theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. You are the most handsome of the sons of men. Grace is poured out upon your lips, and therefore God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and majesty. In your majesty, ride out victoriously for the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness. Let your right hand teach you awesome deeds. Your arrows are sharp in the heart of the king's enemies. The peoples fall under you. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has appointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. Your robes are all fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. From ivory palaces, stringed instruments make you glad. Daughters of kings are among your ladies of honor. At your right hand stands the queen in gold of Ophir. Hear, O daughter, and consider, and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house, and the king will desire your beauty. Since he is your Lord, bow down to him. The people of Tyre will seek your favor with gifts, the richest of the people. All glorious is the princess in her chamber, with robes interwoven with gold. In many-colored robes, she is led to the king, with her virgin companions following beside her. With joy and gladness, they are led along as they enter the palace of the king. In the place of your fathers shall be your sons. You will make them princes in all the earth. I will cause your name to be remembered in all generations. Therefore, nations will praise you forever and ever. Well, let's start with an introduction to Psalm 45. Look a bit at the superscript. To the choir master, according to the lilies, a maskil of the sons of Korah, a love song. Choir master was the person in charge of worship. And there was about more than 50 psalms with the superscript, originally applied to Asaph and his brothers, 1 Chronicles 16:7. According to the lilies, is probably the melody to which the psalm was originally sung. Of course, that's lost in antiquity, but we assume the lilies was a popular song. Maybe it was a wedding song. But anyway, the melody of that is what's used for the words here. It's also in the superscript of Psalm 69. It's said to be a maskil. Now, maskil is a musical term whose exact meaning is obscure. The root has to do with, success and prospering and wisdom and prudence, though exactly how any of that fits here is not entirely clear. It's also a song of the sons of Korah. The sons of Korah was a Levitical guild established by David, which actually continued to work even into the post-exilic period. And Psalms 42 through 49, 84 and 85, and 87 and 88 are all attributed to the sons of Korah. And we say a little bit more about that on our video lecture on Psalms 42 and 43. And it's also said to be a love song, Yadidot, which goes along with it being a wedding psalm. It's a love song having to do with desire. Now, how does one approach this psalm? And at least among conservative scholars, there tend to be two approaches. One is a purely messianic allegorical view. This approach takes the king as King Messiah. The bride would then be Israel in the Old Testament context, or the church after the coming of Christ. And the whole thing would be understood as an allegory. Commentator Leupold, in his commentary on Psalms, and some of the older traditional commentators in both Judaism and Christianity took this approach to the psalm. They saw it as an allegory of God's marriage to his people. But there are some objections to this allegorical view. One, some details appear to be literal rather than allegorical, especially in verses 9, 10, and 12. For example, who are the king's daughters and the noble ladies of verse 9 under this allegorical view? Whose people and father's house is the church to forget in verse 10, if this is an allegory? Who is the daughter of Tyre who's coming with a gift to Christ's wedding, if this is an allegory of Messiah's wedding to the church as bride of Christ? Leupold tries to address this by saying we can scarcely dare to attach special meanings to the daughter of Tyre or the rich ones among the people. But the fact that he's unable to do so renders questionable this overall allegorical view. Moreover, there's a lack of precedent or situation in life for purely messianic psalms. I mean, when would you sing this wedding psalm if it was only an allegory of God's marriage to his people? I suppose you could sing it as a hymn in the Old Testament times, but it's similar to the problem with Psalm 2. If it were a real royal wedding of the Davidic king, it would be a little easier to see the occasion on which it could be sung. And so that leads to the second approach to this psalm, which is the approach that I'm going to adopt. And that is that this is a indirectly messianic royal wedding psalm. In other words, it was a royal wedding song used first of the Davidic king, the king that was contemporary with the poet. Could have been Solomon, though this is by no means certain. And then it was used in the wedding of various Davidic kings thereafter. And applied to the Davidic kings is full of all kinds of hyperbole about how good and how lovely the king was and the bride and the occasion. But all of those hyperbolic statements will find more literal fulfillment in an application to Christ and the church. So let's look at the outline of the psalm. It begins with, as we saw, the superscript, which we've already gone over. But then verse 1 gives the poet's introduction. Verses 2 through 8 praises the royal groom. Verses 9 through 15 praises the royal bride. And then 16 and 17 gives final words to the king. So let's start with verse 1, the poet's introduction. My heart overflows with a pleasing theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. And so here the poet, presumably one of the sons of Korah, perhaps in the original versions, serving as the soloist, the poet indicates how pleased he is to write the psalm and how easy it was to be able to put his words to the page. So was the theme that he was addressing so easily approached. And then we go to the next section, verses 2 through 8, which praises the royal groom. You are fairer than the sons of men. Actually, let me read the text. You're the most handsome of the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore, God has blessed you forever. That's the English Standard Version. Other versions, I think New American Standard says, thou art fairer than the sons of men. The beauty of the king is not primarily the royal attire or his physical beauty, but in accordance with the messianic ideal, the king's beauty at least should be also that of character. And hence it refers to his gracious lips. Grace is poured out upon your lips in the parallel line and the divine blessing. And God's blessing doesn't come because we happen to be physically beautiful. That has to come on the basis of character, either that or pure unmerited favor. Note that applied to any Davidic king except Christ, this is mere hyperbole. But it's literally true of Christ's beauty that he is far fairer, though not necessarily physically so, than any other human being. The traditional hymn, Fairest Lord Jesus, is based on this particular text. It says that grace is poured out upon your lips, and therefore God has blessed you forever. The gracious words of the king conveys the notion that a king's words in judgment and decision-making should be gracious and kind when speaking to his subjects. As it continues to praise the king, it speaks of his military prowess in verses 3 through 5. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and majesty. In your majesty, ride out victoriously for the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness. Let your right hand teach you awesome deeds. Your arrows are sharp in the heart of the king's enemies. The people fall under you. Of course, one of the roles of a king is to serve as a military leader. He girds a sword and is called a mighty warrior, mighty one in the text here. Gibor has military connotations. He rides victoriously in verse 4a, and his arrows accurately strike his enemies in verse 5. These military activities are not in the ideal wars of conquest or plunder, but to uphold truth and meekness and righteousness. The word translated meekness could possibly mean affliction and refer to those who are afflicted or oppressed, for whom the king goes to battle to liberate from oppression. Or you could take the whole thing as a three-word indictus, that he goes in the cause of truly humble righteousness, that his zeal for justice is not overbearing or arrogant, but humble, even though he himself is a great warrior. Now, if we were to apply this to the end of the Davidic line, King Jesus, well, Jesus is a mighty warrior, and he's a just judge, and he will come at the end of the age to put down all the enemies of God, as you see in the book of Revelation, and he will judge his people at in the end times. And yet he's humble, as that passage in Zechariah 9 says. He showed himself humble as king even by coming to Jerusalem on a donkey. The king, verses 6 and 7, will administer divine justice. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. Now, what's remarkable here is that the king is being addressed, but the king is addressed as God. Thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. And the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 8 actually quotes this verse to prove the divinity of Christ and his superiority over the angels. But this has proved a problem to commentators who, because it's a very odd thing to address a human king, as the psalm was probably originally addressed to a human king, as God. And so there's been attempts to soften that somehow. Some would say, well, that's line, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, is speaking of Yahweh, the Lord, not the human king. But the context doesn't really allow that, because it's the king being addressed throughout this psalm, not God. A view that takes it most literally is the Messianic only interpretation, and saying, well, yes, it's addressing the Messiah as God because the Messiah is God, and therefore it cannot be applied to any other ancient king of Israel. And so it's evocative, addressing the king, and the king is God, as it says in Isaiah 9:6, which actually refers to the Messiah as mighty God, using that same word, Gibor. However, we have some difficulties, as we've already stated, with the view that it had no application to the Davidic kings in historical times, as we've already suggested. Others try to weaken the rendering by rendering it not thy throne, O God, but your divine throne. That's how the Revised Standard Version translates it. That's how a Jewish translation, Tanakh, which Jews don't generally think of the Messiah as divine, that's how Tanakh also takes it. The wording might be understood something like, your throne of God is forever and ever, in the sense of your divine throne is eternal. Such an interpretation could make good sense in context, and it would refer back to the Davidic promise in 2 Samuel 7 of an eternal dynasty. But it's ungrammatical, unfortunately. It requires a broken construct chain, as they would call it in Hebrew, which is very rare. And to say this, one would say the throne of thy God. That's the best way to say thy divine throne, just as the mountain of thy holiness means thy holy mountain, and use King James English. And so that's a problem. Thy divine throne is ungrammatical. And it would also imply that Hebrews 1:8 misinterpreted the text, which those of us who are theologically conservative would find problematic. Other attempts, thy throne is God forever and ever. Grammatically, this is possible, but such an expression, what it would mean is highly problematic. You know, the Davidic throne is neither the substance of God, nor does it represent God in some symbolic way. If it were the Ark of the Covenant, it might make sense, but not the throne of David. And so even though grammatically that's a possible rendering, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Commentator Craigie suggested, thy God has enthroned you. He has to revocalize the text to make the word throne to be a verb. And therefore, thy God is the subject of it. Thy God has enthroned you. The problem with this is that it involves changing the text from a noun to a verb. And moreover, there's no evidence that there's any such verb in the biblical Hebrew. And so it's theoretically possible, Craigie's suggestion, but it doesn't seem likely. The view that seems most likely to me is to take it as the traditional renderings make it, addressing the king. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, where the king is addressed as using the word Elohim, God. But this is a dramatic metaphor hyperbole. How is it that you address the king as God? Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Well, the king represents God. He rules under God. He administers God's justice as defined in the law of God. And as a figure of speech, he then serves as God, administering the kingdom of God on earth for God. Now, that's kind of a highly risque metaphor to use, since to call a human being God, but understood as hyperbole, it does make the most plausible sense of the language here. Taken that way, then verse 6 is a instance of sensus planor, which means that the words of the text find a fuller sense, a deeper meaning when applied to Christ. So in the first instance, the text referred to the king as God because the king ruled on God's throne and for God, though he's not actually God. But when applied to Jesus Christ, the ultimate fulfillment, Jesus Christ really is God. And hence, Hebrews 1:8 is not incorrect in seeing that fuller meaning here. Ruling for God and administering God's justice means God's favor for the king, as verse 7 says. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has appointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. Now, note that this expression, God, your God, originally would have read Yahweh, your God, Yod-He, Vav-He, Y-H-W-H. This is Psalm 45 is in book 2 of the Psalter. And books 2 and books 3 of the book of Psalms are the books which are known as the Elohistic Psalter, where it looks like that the editors, in order to avoid using the divine name Yahweh, have often substituted the word Yahweh, substituted for that the word Elohim, which is God. And so God, your God, has appointed you was originally Yahweh, your God, has appointed you. The Lord, your God, has appointed you. And again, that's just a phenomena of book 2 and book 3 of the Psalter, that this happens quite frequently. Now, it lists various virtues of the king: loving righteousness, hated wickedness. And these virtues of the king are more literally true when applied to Jesus Christ, who loves righteousness and hates wickedness in an absolute kind of way. In verse 8, it continues its praise of the royal groom. Your robes are all fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. From ivory palaces, stringed instruments make you glad. It describes the king in the royal wedding scene, where the king is bridegroom, and the wedding scene with its perfume smells and wedding music. Again, going along with this being a wedding song, a song of love. Now transitions to praising the royal bride, verses 9 through 15. First of all, mentions the bride. Daughters of kings are among your ladies of honor. At your right hand, the queen stands the queen in gold of Ophir. The queen is actually the bride, the woman who is about to become queen. She is not quite queen yet. And she is all gloriously attired for her wedding day. and her entourage is with her, the ladies of honor that accompany her. And she's adorned in the gold of Ophir. And there's some debate as to exactly where Ophir is. One guess is the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, perhaps Yemen. But in any case, it's the rarest and finest of gold that she's wearing on this particular occasion. And then the poet goes on to give the bride some advice. Hear, O daughter, and consider and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house, and the king will desire your beauty. Since he is your Lord, bow to him. The people of Tyre will seek your favor with gifts, the richest of the people. Now, there's several little pieces of advice here. Number one, accept your separation from your kin and devote yourself to your king husband. Now, you have to understand that many times weddings to a king involved a marriage alliance where the bride might be from a foreign country marrying into the royal family of Judah. You saw that in the case of Solomon, who had many foreign wives, but it happens later on in the history of Israel too. And that would mean that the bride might never see her family again, given the difficulty of travel in those days. And so, she is advised, forget your people and your father's house, devote yourself to your husband. A bride who marries a husband who lives far away from home might well be tempted to be lonely and homesick. But try to put that aside and accept this new situation that you're in. She's also advised to be confident that the king will love her and desire her beauty. And again, that's if she completely devotes herself to him, that's going to make that easier for him. And the king will desire your beauty. Be confident in that. Then the advice, give the king his proper respect. Since he is your Lord, bow down to him. In this case, he's not just a husband who should be given respect in any case, but he is also the king. And so give him that proper respect. And then be aware of your noble position that you're going to have as a result of this marriage. The people of Tyre will seek your favor with gifts, the richest of the people. Due to her relationship with the king, foreigners will entreat her favor and be aware that she will have this noble position. It now moves on to her entrance into the palace in verses 13 through 15. All glorious is the princess in her chamber. Literally, in her chamber is within. With robes interwoven with gold. In many colored robes, she is led to the king with her virgin companions following behind her. With joy and gladness, they are led along as they enter the palace of the king. Again, it describes the bride's entrance into the royal palace to be with the king now as wife, attired with both inward and outward beauty. You might get inner chamber if you understand that within. It might be that she is glorious within herself, within her character, rather than within her chamber. Either way is acceptable rendering and understanding. But she's also adorned in many colored robes, has the outward beauty as they go to consummate the marriage. Now, how do these verses apply today? Well, we can apply the advice to the queen-to-be. We can take some of that and argue that it's fairly universal for all people that get married. When you marry, as Genesis 2:24 says, you leave your father and mother and cleave to your spouse. And so your spouse becomes your new priority. Your parents are, in a emotional sense, at least, left behind, because that's how the new marriage is going to work best if that happens. So that advice to the bride-to-be is universally applicable. To trust in your spouse's love, that's universally applicable. To show respect for your spouse, that's universally applicable. Even to understand that you now have a new privileged position and responsibilities applies to any marriage once you marry. But another application is to Christ and his bride, the church. Applied to Christ, the bride must be the church, for Christ did not marry otherwise. For Christ, the church has forsaken father and mother if need be, because he is our first loyalty, not only heritage that we have in biological family. Christ has desired the church for his bride. The bride of Christ bows down to Christ as Lord. As bride of Christ, the church has a privileged position. In the letters to the churches in Revelation, we'll even rule under Christ. So we have this privileged position. Now, it is tough to find allegorical meaning to the queen of Tyre and the rich among the people there. And so it's not necessary to allegorize every element of it, but certainly the general principle that we have a privileged position upon because of our marriage to Christ. And the church will have a glorious wedding around the time of the second coming. You see that described in the marriage supper of the Lamb in Revelation 19. And it also uses bride imagery in Revelation 21 as the description of the New Jerusalem. The psalm concludes with some words to the king in verses 16 and 17. In place of your fathers shall be your sons. You shall make them princes in all the earth. I will cause your name to be remembered in all generations. Therefore, nations will praise you forever and ever. Now, from the Hebrew here, it's a little bit ambiguous in English, but from the Hebrew, the person being addressed is the king. Hebrew has gender in its second person forms. It also has number. And the yous or the yours in all these verses are second masculine singulars. And therefore, it has to be addressing a male, you being the king. And even a very fine commentator, Leupold, made the mistake of applying it to the queen here, but it can't be grammatically from the Hebrew. Verse 6 emphasizes continuity of the royal dynasty in accordance with the promise of 2 Samuel 7. And that relates to the marriage, because out of the marriage will come the royal offspring who will fulfill that. So your name will be remembered in all generations, and nations will praise you forever and ever. This is going to be an eternal dynasty, and that dynasty will be forever remembered. That royal fame, all the Davidic kings certainly remain famous, especially the good ones, but even some of the bad ones, as it turns out. But when you apply this to Jesus Christ, it's even more true. He will be remembered to all generations. All nations will praise Christ. Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess Jesus Christ as Lord. And so this has again, a sensus plenior when applied to Christ. Verse 16 applied to Christ must be to his spiritual offspring. You will make them princes in all the earth. In place of your fathers will be your sons, and you'll make them princes in all the earth. Well, Christ doesn't have any literal biological offspring, but he does have spiritual offspring. Believers are his children, as it were. And he himself brings many sons to glory, as Hebrews 2:10 and 13 mention. And so that would have to be applied to believers. And so we come to the conclusion. Like the coronation psalm of Psalm 2, the royal wedding psalm of Psalm 45 was retained in the post-exilic Psalter, or Book of Psalms, because of the belief that there would be a new Davidic king to which it would apply. In other words, even after the exile, when there are no more Davidic kings, they anticipated that God would fulfill that promise of 2 Samuel 7 and what the prophets had been saying to restore the Davidic monarchy, at which time a wedding psalm could be used again for the king. In the providence of God, when the Messiah came in the person of Jesus Christ, his application was fuller and richer than the original meaning. The hyperboles are most fitting when applied to Christ. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. He really is God. The righteousness described of the king is really true of Christ, not so much true of the human kings who had their sins and flaws. That he would be honored forever and ever is fitting of Christ in a way that is not fitting of the human kings. But it is then both a historical psalm and, in a typological or sensus planar way, predictive. We still look forward to the marriage supper of the Lamb, to the time when the church, as the bride of Christ, is married to Christ forever. And so that's my discussion of Psalm 45. Psalm 45 being a royal wedding psalm that has application to both the kings of Judah and to Jesus Christ. And I am Dr. Joe Sprinkle.